Now, on the food issue, this is also impacting things because farmers have to run equipment to farm. And they're saying now that we're going to run into serious problems with that. Now, the Morning Call in Pennsylvania had this story. They said, could a food shortage be coming? Record diesel prices are crushing Pennsylvania farmers, lawmakers are being told. It says a Light County farmer recently called Kyle and said something like, I've got a tractor hooked up to my corn planter out here, no diesel fuel, and I can't afford to get any. Now, remember, a lot of farmers have to go into debt in order to buy their seeds and buy their equipment for the planting season and the harvest season. If they go into debt to get it, they're not going to be able to, again, spend a whole lot more than what they already are unless they raise prices or they just farm less. Now, it says the overall testimony suggested the dire farm situation will exacerbate the rate of already steep food increases. The federal government reported last week that food prices in May were 10.1% higher than a year earlier, with the rate of increase gaining speed. After the hearing in a phone interview, he made it clear that food may not be as available because of the fuel price surge. Meanwhile, another food processing plant has burst into flames. Zero Hedge has this story. And, again, I had the Goya Foods CEO on not too long ago. You can watch the interview still. We have it up. And he was saying basically in his assessment, the reason a lot of these food processing plants are catching on fire is because the equipment tends to be pretty sensitive to that. And if you run the equipment too hard, if you're overworking the equipment, it will burst into flames. Now, he's suggesting that's the cause. A lot of people suspect foul play. I'm not saying either is true. You be the judge of that. But frankly, it's getting pretty dang suspicious at this point because it's happening on a lot of fronts. Now, again, I've mentioned before, if you read about food crisis in the past, famines in the past, specifically under communist regimes, thank you, Jared Munch, Lee County, Pennsylvania. If you look at famines that have taken place in many parts of the world under, again, communist systems, whether it's in China under Mao Zedong, whether it's in Russia under Lenin, Stalin later, oftentimes you saw these same things happen, which is really suspicious, frankly, in my opinion. During these food crises in other countries that happened under communist regimes, aka socialist governments, because communism in government would be called socialism, right? Communism in its full realization would be the negation of systems. So communism in practice under a government is always socialism. And we have government officials who are self-proclaimed socialists now, some of them openly. The policies have caused this over and over again every single time they've been put into practice. And every single time they've been put into practice, well, almost at least, you've seen these types of patterns where, again, food processing plants or food supplies or livestock were suddenly getting killed off or burned and so on. In other words, what we're seeing right now, intentional or not, is following a historical pattern common with the same type of political ideology that people running this country are claiming that they hold. And again, all of this always in the past came right before a famine where millions, tens of millions of people died. Now it says here, this is Zero Hedge. Another food processing plant went up in flames. According to local news, Stevens Point Journal, a fire ripped through a pizza making plant. This again, a lot of them are like different types of food products. You've seen many though. A pizza making plant in Wisconsin on Monday. More than 70 firefighters from multiple fire departments battled a massive fire at Festive Foods in eastern Portage County that began around 9 o'clock local time. The American Red Cross, oddly enough, arrived on the scene shortly after to provide food and water to firefighters. They snapped 2 pictures of the blaze showing flames erupting from the facility's roof and a column of thick, dark smoke pouring into the air. Now, again, people would say, well, a pizza processing plant, so what? But when you look at the full picture of it, you have a pizza processing plant here, you have other processing plants in other places. The issue is not a single incident, but rather the collective whole of all the incidents. And then you had a really weird incident also happened where thousands of cattle died of what they claim was extreme heat. This is in Kansas. Let me show you this. It says thousands of cattle have died across Kansas in what officials have attributed to extreme heat and humidity amid soaring temperatures. Now, they said at least 2,000 cattle died. They claimed temperatures reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit over the weekend. Other estimates say that the number of dead cattle could be over 10,000. And if you watch, for example, the culling of chickens, because they're claiming that you have an issue with avian flu. If you look at the destruction of eggs, again, farms for eggs. If you look at some of the culling of cattle in other places, which they blamed on E. coli, this again fits the weird, broader pattern that we're watching. Now, again, call it intentional, call it natural, call it accidental, through neglect or whatever else. Whatever you want to say, the trajectory is something we've seen practice before, something we've seen happen before. And previously in history, this did in fact lead to famine. Now, those of you curious, let me actually show you a video of these cattle. This is on Twitter. And again, people are wondering what the heck is going on. This is a video of these dead cattle. That, again, some say 2,000 or plus, some say 10,000. Numbers aren't really clear on this. That's on Instagram. Now, I don't know if I need to show you this whole video, but you get the idea. That's about a third of a way in. And it just keeps continuing like that. Just rows and rows and rows and rows of dead cattle. They're claiming from heat. Now, I would assume cattle can normally withstand pretty high heat, especially given the history of cowboys marching them, across the hills and everything else, that normally they don't die from that. But again, these aren't normal times, so who knows? I've seen temperatures hit 100 degrees in California, and people have farmland out there and cattle out there, and cattle don't die like that. But hey, weird times we're in, right? Now, on that note, too, it's actually not just food that's having these issues. It's also the water supplies. And we're also watching some really, really weird things with water. I mentioned previously that in California, they're having a water crisis as well. Part of that is caused by bad policy, which is taking the actual water supply that could give water to most of the state, and they're dumping it into the ocean because of environmental policies to protect a species of salmon that actually has been shown to not even benefit from the policies, but they keep the policies in place anyways. One of the proposed legislations in California is to actually pay farmers, have a budget to pay farmers to stop farming, which is really weird. Frankly, especially if they're saying we're going to have starvation, why would you pay farmers to stop farming is really, really weird. And they say it's to, again, protect the water supply and protect the fish. Now, Zero Hedge has this. They say the real Deadpool, America's drought, is worse than you think. It says we were foolish enough to believe we could water the entire southwestern U.S. with the Colorado River. Nothing could go wrong, but now it has. And tens of millions of people are staring down the barrel of real trouble. As much as 75% of water from Lake Mead, again, fed by the Colorado River, goes to agriculture. And again, if 75% of the supply for water for farming is suddenly cut off, where do farmers get their water from? Right? If you can't water your crops, what happens to your crops? 75% relying on this, and now you're having a water supply and the source of water for that. What's going to happen to the crops, let alone our ability to have drinking water? Now, it says we have a potential for food production problems. Major cities like Las Vegas depend on that water for its citizens, and now we have the potential for personal survival problems for local residents. Hey, and Angela Ritola is noting, Josh, I'm not buying it on the cattle. He says, I lived in Kansas for several years, and it was not uncommon to get up to 110 degrees almost every summer, and the cattle did not die. Yeah, kind of what I suspect too. So they're saying 100-degree weather killed maybe 10,000 or more cattle. And as Angela's noting in that same state, that degrees often hit 110 degrees, and the cattle didn't just die by the thousands, right? I'm not buying it either personally. I think the whole thing is weird. Now, on this note, we're watching all these different factors with this, all these different pieces with this. Again, not only a food crisis, but a water crisis. And I didn't even mention the issue with the fertilizers, because as, again, the CEO of Goya Foods said during our interview, he doesn't believe the weird fires at the food processing plants and stuff. He doesn't personally believe those are going to be the real source of a food crisis, but he does believe that what's going to cause a food crisis is a shortage in fertilizers. And again, that's another crisis in and of itself. Now, there's a quick update on that, which apparently they're claiming, at least, the U.S. does have a surplus of fertilizers, some emergency reserves. We'll see if that's enough, because they are restricting shipments of them in the U.S. because some of the rail lines have policies on that. Weird stuff. But the United Nations itself now is warning that we're heading towards starvation, mass starvation globally. And this is what they're saying. This is the United Nations, folks. This is the Guardian reporting. Marching towards starvation. United Nations warns of hell on earth if Ukraine war goes on. And I should note that it looks like the Ukrainian war is going to be happening for the foreseeable future, so it probably is going to go on. I'm going to touch on that in just a bit. It says dozens of countries risk protests, riots, and political violence this year as food prices surge around the world. The head of the food aid branch of the United Nations has warned. Now, this is the important point. Ukraine supplies like 100% of grain supplies in some African countries. Ukraine and Russia combined supply a lot of the world's food in general. If you're going to have a food crisis in addition to the oil crisis and the fertilizer crisis and the financial crisis and the housing crisis, all this happening simultaneously, right? This also affects security. This also affects a lot of other things. Because, well, if people don't have food, well, they might rob people. If people don't have food, they might get angry at their politicians and start a riot. If people don't have food, you might see violence. You might see a lot of other issues. And they're noting this. This is what the United Nations is saying. We are already seeing riots in Sri Lanka and protests in Tunisia, Pakistan, and Peru. And we've had destabilization take place in places like Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, etc. They're saying this is only a sign of things to come. On the note, the Sri Lanka protests are interesting. They're actually beating politicians. They're targeting politicians, and they're like stripping them and beating them and humiliating them and everything else. A lot of the media isn't even reporting this stuff. Now, what does that mean outside of these countries, outside of Sri Lanka and Africa? Right, South Asia and Africa, mostly some parts of Latin America. Well, what policies are affecting the rest of the world given these countries? Well, the open border policies. If you don't have food, if your country is falling into chaos, if there's civil war or people are killing or beating politicians in your country, if, again, it's no longer safe because people are robbing people because they're starving to death, what's going to happen? Right? What happens then? Well, typically you either stay and deal with a crisis or you leave and try to immigrate. Now, I guarantee you we're going to see mass immigration, the likes of which we've probably never seen, of African countries, people in Africa and probably even South Asia, trying to flee into Europe. Also, the United States has thrown the border wide open. And not only that, but they're even giving them financial benefits to come here, including loan programs through, again, the United Nations. They offer them loan programs under the International Organization of Migration, subsidized by American taxpayers under the State Department.